Hello. Here I am, a survivor of the heat, so my hair's a little bit mussed up. Um, but anyway, I'd had a nap of all things. Of all things. So, welcome back to the channel. I'd like to talk about a few things that some trans content creators who are positioned as conservative, even on the right, supporting Trump, etc., try to support, engage in, disseminate through their channels. So these content creators have massive followings. And of course, some of them are trans people as well. I don't want to say that trans people somehow are always on the left. Trans people can be of all political persuasions, religious beliefs, non-religious beliefs. There is no one way of being trans. But one of the things that's very interesting about these content creators is they do get a lot of clicks, including from the anti-woke brigade, those who criticize, quote, little L liberals. And that politics is very particular to the United States of America. I'm in Australia, and whilst there is some uptake of well, on the one hand, you could see wokeism, and then the other hand, anti-wokeism, there's really not those extremes. So, really speaking, Australia is, for better or worse, quite stable politically, and there is some polarization that goes on about some particular issues. But the trans issue, as if it's one thing, sorry, it's not really prominent. Trans lives, again, for better or worse, have become much more visible. And some of the contentions do get kicked around, including in political contexts, electoral cycles, and so on. So here's a few themes that I've noticed from these trans content creators telling stories of desisters or detransitioners. Okay, so I'm old enough to know that some people discontinue transition. And just to draw on a story from my own youth, a friend of the family, much loved, probably when, let's see, they were about 15 or 16, decided to begin transition. So this was in the 1980s. It was well within the first kind of upswing of fear around HIV/AIDS, and coming out as gay, as trans, which wasn't the word we used then, it was transsexual, was really difficult, and it was an unknown because in the culture it was considered to be very, very fringe. So services to transition medically were not abundant, and it was really tough. So there used to exist this thing called the real life test. And I know that's true in other Anglophone countries, including the US, that there were very strict guidelines as to being diagnosed with gender identity disorder or transsexualism, undergoing medical transition. First of all, the real life test. In the beginning, you had to actually commit to living a cross-gendered life for at least a year, in some places 2 years. And this was without being on hormones. So it wasn't especially common for children to follow this path. There weren't services of this kind, let alone the model of gender affirmative care. Instead, it was an extremely staggered process with multiple points of monitoring and assessment, psychological being very important in that picture, and existing within university gender clinics, and so on. Predominantly, those seeking such services, whether with the support of parents or not, but oftentimes with the support of parents if they were young, right? They underwent this real life test and had to go through a battery of psychological counselling to ascertain whether they were, quote, a true transsexual. And so in some ways that was really meaningful because it was very conservative. So some of the trans content creators, such as Buck Angel, point to that era. Buck refers to himself as a tranper. And I'm not Buck's age, but I'm not far from it. So he makes note of the fact that these things used to be in place, and so you did not have these blowouts in transition and desistance and so on, which in his mind are really spiraling out of control. So back to my story, we had a friend of a family who took the name Trish, and effectively they came out of the show world. They'd already been cross-dressing and working, yes, as a drag queen. But they began to question their sexual identity and identify as a woman, and began to seek out services for psychological assessment and also to undergo the real life test. And I remember Trish being welcomed in our family. My mum was completely positive about all of this. Trish was part of the family. And for about a year or two, was living in that role, was supported by Trish's parents, but also warned about disclosing about their process, their identity to relatives in the UK. They made a trip to the UK and basically had to kind of, I guess for a time, assume a boy identity for extended family members because the fear was that that would cause undue stress. So whether as a result of that or just their own internal processes, whether as a result of the challenges of transition or a change in heart, Trish decided to detransition. And that kind of came out of the blue because a lot of us had accepted her, who now decided that he was him, that is, a gay man. But we accepted that as well. This was way before the age of the internet. This is the 80s. You have to imagine mid to late 80s. So they were involved in a process of detransitioning. It's not clear to me whether they had begun medical transitioning or whether that was still within the terms of the real life test. And of course, the real life test was set up as a marker in case it wasn't right for you. So Buck also notes this. By and large, those that sought psychological assessment and medical transition and any other kinds of therapies, including electrolysis and surgery, they were male to female. I cannot remember that many female to males. Not that there weren't any, but, you know, it wasn't in the public discourse, in the public eye. And, you know, from what we know from research, we can say that by and large, far and away, the greater number of people requesting access to these forms of psychological assessment and undergoing the real life test were, in fact, natal males. So, excuse me for not using terminology such as assigned male at birth. This was not the terminology of the time. People tended to say sex change as well, independently of whether, like people actually pursued SRS, which again was far and away really hard to access, expensive, and so on, not covered by the public purse. So culturally, this was seen as being a real minority of people, and the word transgender didn't exist. That only really came to the fore in the mid-90s in Australia, and even then it was very much a community term. Didn't really infiltrate social services, and the gender affirmative care model was decades away. The idea of childhood transition, young adult transition, and not having to undergo the real life test, that was unimaginable at that time. But because of that, also, detransition wasn't politicized. We had no way of knowing just how many people, and the terminology then was failed the real life test. Now, I don't see it as a failure. I see it as this helps you to work yourself out. Ostensibly, some people give an approximate number of 1% of all people transitioning. And it's argued that that has really risen, especially in the United States and in the UK, in some gender clinics such as Tavistock, where there's been a bit of a fast and loose approach to green lighting transition. But having said that, coming up to date, those sorts of issues haven't emerged in the name of gender affirmative care in Australia. We live a very different set of situations here. That's not to say that people do not detransition. The real life test is no longer a requirement. An informed consent model for adults is used, but it is really hard for young people and children to access these services, and there is no green lighting going on. There may be an increase, and this is not just recent, this is the last 10-15 years, of transitioners from female to male. So there's a bit of a parity now, but all of the scandals and back talk about gender affirmative care, the responsibility of clinicians, the fast tracking and so on, they have not been issues in the context of Australia. To be sure, TERFs and people who are opposed to, generally speaking, childhood gender transition, which is usually just social, by the way. There's no medical interventions until someone is well into, the ages of about 16, 17, and it is very uncommon for people to have puberty blockers before. There are cases, but this is not just something that's rolled out. It is still very staggered in Australia, and it is really hard to get through the system. I can think of Westmead, and it's overloaded in Sydney with families desperately seeking to have their children assessed and attended to. So by and large, young people under the age of 16, they have no form of medical intervention that goes on. They have a kind of wait and see, explore your identity, socially live in the other gender, see how that goes for you. So I would argue that the safeguards still exist. So for content creators who really thematize the dangers of a gender affirmative care model that fast tracks, I would ask you to please be attendant to context. I would also ask you not to merely transpose debacles and scandals that have existed or have surfaced within places like the UK, Tavistock and so on, and the US to an Australian context, just because we're also English speakers and we can have similar parliamentary democracies, especially between the UK and Australia. And just because you see the rise to discourse, which posits that children are being coerced into this and that it's a form of abuse, does not mean it is actually so. We need to break away from these hyperbolic pronouncements. Is it valid? Bach and also Blaire White, to foreground the stories of desisters and detransitioners? Yes, it is. And it's interesting. It doesn't undermine the stories of those of us who do transition and for whom it is a really important move, which I guess both of those content creators in their own ways acknowledge. But I would just say that one should be cautious of this hyperbolic sort of social panic about this phenomenon. Recognize, of course, that it's been very politicized. In the past, when you detransition, you just had to sort of go on and live your life. You didn't make a political issue out of it. Some may say there are good reasons for why people are making a political issue. But to say that worldwide this is a problem is erroneous, okay? There are a bunch of other things that get flagged up within the content creation of some of the aforementioned, I don't want to say influencers, commentators. Among them, the figure of the trans predator. That's been really dramatized. The sort of discrimination between the true trans and that individual who, male to female, is considered to be AGP. Kenneth Zucker model, dividing in between transitioners who were effectively homosexual in their pre-transition lives and transitioners who were attracted to men, and then on the other hand, those that are attracted to women and who want to become women as being involved in a certain kind of, philia about femaleness, embodying femaleness. Some people ascribe to that, but I do not think that those kinds of ideas of the homosexual, transsexual, and the heterosexual, transsexual explain all trans experiences. But I also think that the constant interrogation of trans identities prevents us from being able to look at the everyday realities of our lives. And, I share with some of the conservatives the viewpoint that what gets called trans rights is often a kind of empty signifier of people who want to make certain kinds of claims for social approval and validation. I understand that people are psychically vulnerable when they're not seen or recognized. So in a sense, that is kind of a natural impulse, especially if you feel marginalized, and maybe in some cases really are marginalized. But I feel like trans politics is about immigration, is about quality of life issues, is about health, housing, education, pulling up those that are more marginalized within our communities, because being trans is something that is cross-cut by all the usual social differences: race, class, religion, immigration status, chronic health issues, you name it. And there's ableism. There's more that I could mention. There is a whole lot that we could discourse about in terms of our lives. I really wish that content creators would put the accent on that, and also on these substantive issues for those who are most vulnerable in our community. I have housing. I have work. That's the other really important thing, especially during transition. But I have a job where there are resources for transition as well, and respect. The bathroom is not a trans issue. So being old enough to know, I also recognize that that has been hugely politicized and has become such a sticking point when in the past, like trans women and men, we merely accessed the bathroom of our visual presentation related gender. And there was never a quibble, there's never a problem, and it was never about invasion of spaces or anything like that. So yes, there are all sorts of ways in which what for the most part was seen as being, a small portion of our population, just hoping to transition and maintain those quality of life issues to what we have now with transgender and non-binary, where an increasing number of people identify within those terms and may or may not be involved in transition, or may not identify as men or women, may or may not seek to be reaccommodated within the sex gender system and just go on to live their lives. There's a lot of people who make it an identity politics thing. Is that intellectually interesting? A lot of the time it can be a point of discussion and intrigue, but it has also become a kind of distraction, especially in the online space. So this video is getting way too long. I might just stop it there, but I want to say to Blaire, to Buck, I admire you for different reasons. I certainly don't agree on a number of grounds. It's too much to mention there, but it's fine to disagree. I disagree with friends of mine. I do caution, though, about the dramatization of some of these issues and how they play into what is emerging as a kind of fascist politics, maybe beyond our control, the impacts of which we're still to see. I don't want to headlong dismantle, on the basis of generalizations, gender affirmative care. There are important things that, put it this way, the trans movement has fought for. And that has made it a whole lot easier, especially for adults who can make informed consent in conjunction with their GP, in conjunction with a specialist. Of course, we still need services. The rollback, or the potential for rollback, it is concerning because there are young people and young adults who will be impacted by that. And yes, some of them will have mental health crises. And there's a lot of targeting going on. So I would like us to return to the substantive issues of our lives where they are, because as a middle-class trans person or a white trans person, you cannot just speak for everyone, right? There's a lot of cross-cutting issues in our communities, and that's why I say in plural. So without wanting to polarize any further these issues, I would just say peace out. Try to bring it back down to the ground. Enough of these rhetorical stretches and grandstanding on either side. Keep it real.